before I start introducing our guests, how are you doing with your jet lag? You okay, John? Our guest who flew in from Europe. But before I do that, I actually also wanted to really officially welcome Lauren Leatherborough, because as we know, behind every great man there is, before and after him, is a great woman. And so I want to officially acknowledge that and thank Lauren for all the time she had to miss him and that David had to spend time with us. Exactly. Tonight's lecture by John Tuomey is called Light, Sight, and Lasting Presence. And the lecture is sponsored by our favorite fund, the Cunningham, in memory of Barney Cunningham, and will honor Barney's high standards and commitment to building construction, technology, professional practice, and ethics. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight again. It's a huge pleasure to be able to host these lectures, so we're very, very proud of it. John Tuomey is a founding director of O'Donnell and Tuomey. Do I say Tuomey right, John? I have a bit of a European accent still, but it might be the wrong one, I'm thinking. And it was established by Sheila O'Donnell, who we sadly missed tonight, with John in 1988. Tuomey graduated from the University College of Dublin in 1976 and went to London to work with James Starling on the Stuttgart Staatsgalerie, which is one of my favorite buildings. Tuomey then returned to Dublin to work at the Office for Public Works, where he completed two buildings, a laboratory in the landscape and a city courthouse, which laid the theoretical and contextual basis for his future critical practice with Sheila O'Donnell. He was a managing director of Group 91 Architects, an architects collaborative who designed the master plan for the regeneration of Temple Bar as Dublin's cultural quarter. O'Donnell and Tuomey designed two buildings within the quarter, completed in 1996. Tuomey has a leading involvement in architectural education, teaching in the studios at UCD Architecture for nearly 4 decades. He was the inaugural professor of architectural design at UCD from 2008 to 2019, and the chair of external examiners at the Architectural Association in London for many years. I almost joined you there. I think I did that also for many years. Too many years, I would think. As well as the universities of Cambridge and East London. He has taught and lectured widely in European schools of architecture and at North American universities, including Harvard, Princeton, Cooper Union, Columbia, and UPenn. He is the author of Architecture, Craft, and Culture, a reflection on principles of design and thinking behind the work of O'Donnell and Tuomey, published by Gandon Editions in 2004. In 2010, Tuomey was elected a member of Awas Dana, an affiliation of Irish artists. In 2015, he was a joint recipient with Sheila O'Donnell of the RABA Royal Gold Medal and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Brunner Prize, both awarded in recognition of a lifetime's achievement and obviously amazing work. Thank you so much, John, for joining us tonight, and I would like to invite you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David maybe was trying to relax me when he first told me this is the room that Khan used to teach in. I'm happy to be here for David today. Winka just reminds me that David was the chair of the board that made me that inaugural professor of architectural design. So our paths have crossed and we are friends. I think of him. I said in my earlier short tribute that about friendship or like-mindedness, that it doesn't rely on everyday contact. It relies on a kind of feeling of reliance. And so if I come into St. Mary le Strand in London, just as the sun is setting, I put this picture up because when I took this picture, I was thinking of David, because he's the kind of person that you can share moments like this with. And when I was reading his book, Building Time, which is so sensitive to the question of light in space, light in painting, silently and at a distance, our friendship is reinforced by such moments. I know the room he used to sit in here in this institution before he was de-institutionalized. I'm saying to Richard that I really liked Richard's reduction of four-legged chairs. I mean, speaking of architectural furniture, of chairs down to three-legged stools. And now that, of course, David is released from his administrative responsibilities, so now he can only stand on two legs, his own two legs. But I wanted to say, and maybe you can read better than I can read, that these feelings that he has in his work, in his thinking, in his insights, these feelings he has for light, sight, and beyond its weathering, the lasting presence of architecture. I know that from the conversations we've had, from the places we've been to see together, and from the things that he's written. And when I'm reading his writing, I'm in the places we've seen together. And tonight I'm going to talk for David, in a way. I'm going to talk about 5 of our projects, 2 of which he has thought about carefully enough to have written about them, 1 of which he knows, another of which, he knows very well, and 2 of which he doesn't yet know, but he will. It's really his way of seeing that brings me here, that brought us together. And my partner Sheila, who isn't here, sends her greetings, not from a Greek island, but when we walk this amazing, we spend a time walking in the lunar landscapes of looking for little tiny chapels in the bleak landscapes of Greek islands. And when we do, I have to tell you, as a room of his friends, we too talk about Leatherbarrow. There's only me and Sheila and Leatherbarrow out there. And when we go to Rome once a year to look at the same things as I'm sure all of you would do, but there's something about trying to get crane your head into every above and beyond space in San Carlino, and to figure out where the light is coming from or what it's bouncing off. And it's also bouncing off Leatherbarrow. I was there one day and thinking about that scruffy soft pencil plan that Borromini made, as if he's trying to squash that Greek cross into an elongated form in order to fit it onto its tight site. And I suddenly thought about Alto's soft pencil drawings, and about this box that was the casting form for the Savoy vase. And of course, it's not possible that Borromini knew about Alto, but it's very possible that Alto knew about Borromini. And so an original piece of work, an out-of-the-blue invention, such as Alto made, which is all about the lakes in Finland and the unbounded space, is really an answer back to Borromini and effort to make freedom within restriction. So why did Leatherbarrow come to mind when I had that thought? So David, the point I want to credit you with is that continuing conversation about the life within a building, the light within a building, but the life that comes from without to within in a building. On the way to Cork, nearly 20 years ago, we stopped the car to look at a tower house. The tower we saw was not either of these two, but it was falling down so clearly, beautifully falling down, that you could see the section as well as the form. And I remember standing in that lane with you and talking about the perfection of our fortune at that moment to be able to see within and without. But I didn't know that you would now be writing about ruins. I guess that's got something to do with seeing where things come from. And what I'm interested in, and what we talked about that day, was the idea of the solid presence of the ultimate solidity of the form of the thing, but yet the possibility of a void at the center of the form, which is free, but contained, if you see where I'm speaking. And when I came to make a culture centre for the Irish language in the northern city of Derry, this feeling of hollowing out from the inside, as if the project began from the inside, as if something had been subtracted from the inside. The solidity of a tower might have been removed in order to make the core feel stronger than the external form. Voids. I'm talking about the things I've talked about with David in the times that we've met. We've talked about site, we've talked about landscape, we've talked about volume, we've talked about light, and we've also talked about the interconnection of things, tunneling through things, quarrying into things. And so these two photographs from different points, different aspects of things that I've thought about, are here to represent that thought. In the Portico d'Ottavio, it's okay, it's the layers of history that you find when you study this situation, but it's also the breadth of energy that you get from thinking about burrowing right physically through all those layers of history, which I imagine must have inspired Matt Clark when he had the freedom to drill into the fabric of Paris at the time that the Pompidou Centre was under construction. And what I think is so beautiful about the Matt Clark is that it shows that the solid resists, the solid stands, even when being quarried. You know, that it's more beautiful to think of both the conditions of being able to go in again on the historical form, while the historical form stands strong. Now, I say all of this without having heard in advance what it was that David said at the end, which I realize is what I've just been saying. But so it is that we walk in each other's footsteps. I would have spoken, if I had been in better form, about the quarrying that we did in order to open up the forms of the Central European University in Budapest. I would have been happy to come to this university to talk about that university. But politics took over, and the university we built in order to open itself up to the city of Budapest was closed down almost the day that it opened by the politics of Budapest. So I'm not going to talk about that because it's too depressing. Some of those thoughts about what happens to students when they're in a library, or what the freedom offered by being within the books and the view out to the landscape, some of those thoughts, I hope, will be contained in the project that we are building now, that started last month under construction in Dublin for a big new academic library at the centre of the city. And one day, David, you must come and see that. Looks like it's 2023, doesn't it? But I fished around in the studio to think of 5 things I could say back to in today's meeting. And the first is to just mention again, I went with Lauren and David to the Lyric Theatre in Belfast. And not that he was saying what he might be writing, or not that he was saying that he might be writing, but he was thinking, and eventually he did write about this building. And he has this phrase that he coined, verging space, which I guess is like converging with the con removed. And he was thinking there about how this project, which is designed to do with its relationship with its external factors of river and city, but how it really finds its energy inside itself in the volume that is, if you like, separate from the site constraints, but could only come about because of those constraints. So when I heard David earlier talking about whole parts, I was thinking about an Irish poet, John Montague, who talked about the form of the lyric poem being freest when it's closest to speech, to vernacular speech. In other words, that the form, which has to be exact, is made free when it's not overly corseted by its own containment. And somehow the ragged boundaries of our project in Belfast seem to respond to that thought. What we were doing in this project in Belfast was trying to reach out to the river and reach back to the city. And it's a very compromised and very difficult site. But I was thinking about a book that Sheila gave me for my birthday, which was Calder's animal sketching book. And in these pages of drawing cats, Sandy Calder reminds us that a cat asleep has intense action. And I'm trying to transfer that into the idea of plan, which of course must be static, but it must have action. So the action in our plan for the lyric, where David coined his phrase, verging space, is the action of trying to connect the inner organism of a closed institution to connect it outwards, out to the flowing lines of the river and out to the geometry of the city. And then at its center, the acoustic space. I'm sure you all know the bone that Corb used to keep in his pocket, the bone that he produced to illustrate his design for Ronchamp, for his concepts of acoustic space. But in this case, it seems to just fit right onto the plan for the lyric. And the other thing that's on our minds at that time was the question of adaptation or impact of external forces. About Darcy Thompson's theories of form being adapted to do with the surroundings. So it's still a fish, but it's formed in its locale by what has made it grow. And then our project, once it was offered at competition, it then had to shrink. So you draw what you imagine is the most spacious world possible. And when it gets boiled or rolled or forced by the process, you're still trying to fight for that feeling of free space, free volume, even though the dimensions get tighter as the money gets tight. And the thought in this project was that it would somehow rise out of the city, that the brickwork of Belfast, I don't know if any of you have seen the black and white Belfast film that's been out recently, but Belfast is a red brick city, and Belfast has got this feeling of hard, angled, severe street landscape, relieved by the fact that at the end of every street is a view to the mountains or a view to the outer landscape. And we were trying to rise our theatre up among those brick streets. There you see the landscapes at the end of the streets, but that it was speaking back into the brick terraces, but open to the meandering lines of the water of the river. The site is sloping. The project runs kind of against the slope, so that there's a lot of climbing in the project. From the moment you enter the door to the moment you see out to the river to the moment you enter the theatre, it's a climb. And we were trying to orchestrate that climb from within to without, with benches, with adjustments that kind of give you a place to breathe between the moments of climbing. And the analogy we used here was that the volumes, the acoustic volumes of the theatre were like rocks in a stream, and the circulation spaces, like the stairs and the hallways, flowed between them. They were made in stone, the volumes were made in brick, and the analogy was that somehow or other the street of the city was pulled inside the building, and that the civic aspect of the building is that it is itself a street or a river. But we didn't know that that would become the only safe street in which two warring clans could meet and make their peace when the Queen of England shook hands with the former director of the Provisional IRA. They chose for their meeting place a safe street, which was the street of our theatre. The plan you've seen, but the plan I show, because I think that it's the kind of plan that David has been interested in, about how external forces make their impact, but how the form resists or gives back. And how the spaces designed in between become social spaces, spaces for meeting. And how the light from the water or from the air, from the sky, penetrates deep into the center of the building with the natural materials. Same inside, same outside, but weathering differently. And the theatre there is like an acoustic vessel of its own. Designed, really, I'm flicking my ear because it's designed as if it was an ear, you know, with places for the sound to bounce and catch and reflect back down into the body of the audience. So the second project I wanted to show, which David has written about in, I think, Oriented Otherwise, is the gallery in Cork that he came to see on the day we stopped to look at the castle. And here his title was Landings and Crossings. He was thinking about the places in the project where the external conditions cross over with the ideas that generate, the self-contained ideas that generate the internal organization. He was trying, I think, to argue that nothing stands alone, everything is connected. And in this building he was looking for pockets or places where those intersections were at their most acute. So I put in this photograph because this photograph still means so much to me. I took it the day I walked the site with Sheila when we first went there, and where the university, once in my life, only once in my life, they asked if we were to make a building, where should it be and what should it be? You know, just like a student is asked those questions. So they said, oh, so they don't know where to put the building and they don't exactly know what the building should be, but they know they want a building which will be the civic kind of point of civic gathering in the university. It is the most open brief we have yet received. And we walked this site with the buildings officer from the estates office. And I was saying to him, well, you know, the building is already here. You know, you've got these cliffs, you've got this river, you've got these trees. In a way, our job is just to get out of the way here. And so we tried to design a building which doesn't interfere with the perception of the trees, the river, the cliffs. The feasibility that had been prepared for the university for this site was to sensitively build a single story all over the site. And our counter argument to that was we should build tall and we should build small so that every tree on the site survives, and in a way every condition on the site survives, with just the addition of one floating structure in the trees. And since David came with us to see that site, we have added a bridge over the river that you can see, and we've also added a student centre on the other side of the historic quadrangle. So I'm just going to take you through what David saw and what he didn't see. So the thought about raising the building in among the trees was a simple enough thought, because if a building can float up in the canopy of the trees, then all it needs is a very small footprint in order to avoid the roots of those same trees. So you find a building that stands on a stem and spreads out into the branches. And the way we were trying to think about this, and I remember we had this conversation on the site, was thinking about the thought that I think I had thought I had received from Vitcover, but I think David may have corrected me, on the concept of contrapposto. That is to say that it is more interesting to turn the body towards the forces that are outside the scope of the body itself, rather than the body standing static for those forces to approach it. This is the idea of what you might call allocentric balance. And it's not that I'm thinking that our building is a sculpture in itself. It's that I'm thinking that the building is reaching out beyond its own containment to find destinations which it can fix on and which then fix its form more clearly. So it is, so to speak, freed by its attachments to its situation. The only thing we introduced into this whole conversation that I think is perhaps, I was going to say contradictory, but let's say it supplements it by subtracting something, is we took a courtyard out from inside the center of the building. So that when you walk through this building, you pass through the building underneath it, but also inside it somehow. So there is no visible link between how the building is in the sky and how the building is in the ground, meaning that the pedestrian, the student who comes to this civic platform between river and cliff is invited to join either down for a coffee in the cave cafe or up in the ship in the air that is the gallery. And when you're in the ship in the air, there are little splinters of view out to those focal points. It's as if the building is a barrel of containment for art, but it has opened itself to reach the city, to reach the old quadrangle, to reach a church spire in the distance, or to look at the river. Well, this is what David saw. But at the same time as we were drawing this, we were thinking, well, people might want to approach this new, I nearly called it a hub, because when we started our practice, we spent 20 years designing centers, art centers, film centers, drama centers. Nowadays, we don't do centers anymore, we just do hubs. But before this was a hub, we thought you should be able to get across the river And I remember talking with an engineer about this who told me that the quickest way across a river is at right angles to its flow, bank to bank. And I thought, in this case, I don't want to take the quickest path. I want to pull people towards the sinuous arrangement of movement on the site. And so we tried to approach it by what you call approximations. That is to say, to first get yourself up to the point of turning, then turn and cross the river at the angle that seems to suit the situation, and then landing, reorient yourself to find your way back to the city. So it's a sort of a hinged contraption, folding contraption, this bridge. And yes, it crosses the river. And it has arches because this river floods to a difference of 5 meters. So when the floods come through, they have to be allowed out and through those bridge arches. But it's really there to allow you a moment to see that the University College Cork is perched on a cliff facing north to its landscape. So in case you're thinking that we were feeling lucky the day we got to choose the site and the brief and the form for the Glucksman Gallery, put yourself in the position of Dean and Woodward, who were the mid-19th century architects for this university, whose brief was to find a site for the university. And Dean is said to have ridden out of Cork on his horse. Seeing this cliff, he thought, that would do. That hasn't happened to us yet either. But we did get to extend one of Dean's first buildings. He designed an anatomical, I think in those days, medical buildings were kept just one step away from the main quadrangle for fear of, as if there could be anything like infection. And it's no longer an anatomical medical building. It's now, yes it is, a student hub. But we had to extend it, and it's the first building of the campus, but we had to change it, we had to open it, we had to turn it around to become the student-focused building. But we also had to pay respect to it. So we're trying to work with the rhythm of its mullions and with the stoniness of its walls. And we made a hole in it because we saw that it was an additive building, not a singular building. It was made in 5 separate, you can see these 5 separate aspects. So we made a hole right through it, and then we built a wall around it so that it was a safe harbor for the students, like a harbor wall. And then we made a little lantern so they could see back over where they had buried themselves behind the wall. It's a small project, but it was an interesting project because it was right at the core of what regards itself as a historic university. And we're trying to bring people in and then let them see back out from where they have come. And that involves acts of violence on the material status of the structure, but those acts of violence, like any surgical intervention, have to be good for the good of the body. So you can see I'm trying to get the feeling of coming through and coming around within the volume of what's given, and then to add a new volume to the, an equivalent volume to what's been subtracted as a gathering hall, as a market hall for student meeting. In some way, the form of this, the kind of closed form of this, because it's all based around, both projects are based around the university quad, between the gallery and the student centre. We're trying to reinforce the centrality and power of the original quadrangle with this open space, lit from above and looking out over the roofs. At this point, Leatherbarrow runs dry on my work, on our work. He hasn't spoken a word. But I think we did go and see the LSE which is a student centre. This was still a centre in the days of centres, that we made for it's like a town hall for the London School of Economics. Perhaps the most restricted site in a practice that only seems to deal with restricted sites, perhaps the most restricted site we've ever been offered. Halfway through this project, the donor arrived. It's the Saw Sui Hock Student Centre. Saw Sui Hock is a Singapore-based alumnus of the LSE. And during the handshake and thank you very much moment, when his name was being inscribed on the building, he said to me, very interesting, I've been looking at your work. I see you only work on shitty sites. Okay, it was a small, tangled thing where the medieval street pattern arrived at the uncrossable line of Kingsway in London. But we were thinking from the coffee bar near the Pantheon, we were thinking of the glimpsed presence of something that has presence no matter how slight your glimpse of it is. We were thinking about trying to hollow something out of that and to push the building, which is so restricted, to push it into independence. And then on another day, David has written about the February air. One February, in a misty day, we were staying in Venice, and I suddenly thought, look at these buildings. These buildings are moving. I mean, they can move. You look away and you look back, and are you sure they are in the same position? The water is moving, but aren't the buildings in some way buoyant, or don't they have intense action? So we wanted our town hall at the LSE not to be held back by its constraints, but to kind of spring back out of that confinement of rights of light and building permit and angles of sunlight and all the constraints that limit you in these situations. It was intended to be a building with a central atrium and a lot of setbacks. And we thought, well, perhaps if we had no atrium and no setbacks, we could kind of start again with a freestanding building, as if it was moving. And so we only thought about it in the lines of approach, down the streets. So you can see that in this perspective, you can see how the bottom line of one angle hits the bottom of the side of the street, the top of it hits the other side, and so the building is folded as you approach it to bring you inside it. And the street, in the LSE, the streets, it's a street-based campus, and so the street network continues up and into the building without a barrier. So you can see that you might enter this building and find yourself spiraling. And that the way that the bricks are formed, the bricks have also, if our project has to suffer, the bricks were also made to suffer. You know, those bricks know that they're on an angled and twisted site. And once you get into the swing of it, you're only making wooden boxes. So you can cast the bricks, to be any shape you choose, as long as you count them and measure them and make them work together. And Sheila was drawing them, and drawing the idea of spacing the bricks out from each other so that a south-facing building could be naturally cooled or naturally ventilated or screened from the sun, and so that practices that, such as worship and exercise, might have their privacy, and that the social areas might be more revealed. And the whole building leans in order to avoid stepping. It leans to admit the legal requirements for light, the rights to light, the rights to sky component, and all of the constraints. The building tries to shrug them off, as if to say, I was here already. What's the bother? And one of the nicest things that anyone ever said to me who went looking for this building is they walked right past it without knowing it was there. That wasn't Leatherbarrow, but it's the kind of thing you would say. Then we got to do the space outside the building, because it was a very busy street with buses, and it seemed wrong, so we quietened it down and made some lamps that looked like they belong inside the building, but they've kind of shuffled their way out onto the street. And maybe the most important thing we did was, in this really tiny site, is we chopped a bit of it off and gave it back to the street. So the building suffered. It suffered the sacrifice of giving something back. And when you give a little bit of ground like that back, you get the whole street in. And those of you who've been through such battles know that they're easily summarized afterwards, but it takes a lot to persuade, especially the London School of Economics, to surrender what they see as property. The building is organized around this pivot point. So you spiral around, all the stairs spiral around the lift shaft, but the lift shaft is like a totem pole at the center of the building. And so it's swirling as you experience it. You're between the inside of a warehouse and the outside of the street. And it has so many different functions that student centers need, from noisy to quiet, from discotheque to yoga room, all accommodated in a highly dense and highly controlled, packed section. So now, the first three buildings he has at least seen. The last two, I don't think he has. Winke was kind enough to say that I worked for my mentor. When I was young, when I was a student, Starling was like a distant hero to me because he seemed to stand for so much. And I just give you here the quote that I knew by heart when I was a student, and I still know by heart now. And this book came out when I was studying. And then I found, it was the first and the only proper job I've ever had to work in his office. So it was a lucky start for me. So when we were invited to compete for the Liverpool School of Architecture, which is Starling's alma mater, it seemed so tempting and so important for us to dive into that competition, not only to win the project, it's not a large project, but rather to kind of continue our relationship with the man who helped us so much when we were young. And we thought we would enter the competition in such a way as, so to speak, to teach the site a lesson, to teach the school a lesson about what we thought were values in architecture, or might be the values that the Liverpool School of Architecture had stood for. One of which I heard you mention tonight, which is the studio and the intersection of studio with theory, with thinking, which is the heart and soul of every school of architecture. If I can borrow Richard's three legs for a minute, there only are three legs, aren't there? There's only construction, design, and theory. And so we tried to say here that the first thing about the Liverpool School of Architecture might be that it's open to the whole city. There are no boundaries, there's no walls, there's no courtyards in Liverpool campus. It's an urban campus, and that therefore the building should know that it's in its place. You can see down here, down the bottom, a relationship drawing between the position of the building and the cathedral in Liverpool. So, a groundedness, dare I say, that the building should take its configuration, it should take its energy from the ground up. And the second thing we try to argue is that the building should take its configuration, on the contrary, from the inside out. And that the space of the studio should be the primary concern. So we tried to propose in a small project, we tried to propose a studio that would have a clear span of 30 meters in all directions through the way that and make visible the way that it is constructed. Downstairs, it's a concrete table. On top of that table stands the timber frame studio. And the third argument we made is that everything begins with a plan and that the organization of the school has to make sense. It's not a question of making an extension to the school. It's a question that that extension refreshes, reawakens the internal physiognomy of the connections within the body of the school. So all that between an 18th century Georgian terrace, a 1930s extension, a 1970s kind of satellite roof extension, and then eventually our building, all must make one thing. So you see this continuation between the Georgian, the 1930s, the 1970s rooftop, and our development. And we wanted to make, in the fourth point, I guess, we wanted to make a meaningful whole from its parts. So again, I had not heard your summary. But the tectonics of it, the feeling of its fabric, the feeling of its physique, relating to the physique of its neighboring buildings, so that it's not a stranger in its own. It's a new building, but it's not a stranger in its own territory. So we drew how it would be constructed. We drew how it would sit into the ground and how it would structure its volumes. And the last thing, which you'd imagine would be the first thing in anyone's mind, but the last thing that we presented, is that buildings last a long time, and that the intelligence built into a building has to respond to the current emergency in the climate, but it also has to be good for 200 years, good for 300 years. So there's a responsibility beyond the emergency. There's a responsibility for how the building performs in use, which are the old values of air, light, volume. I'm happy to say that building is just about to go on site. So you soon have to come again across the Atlantic. This is its connection to the cathedral, to the Gibbard Cathedral, which itself is built on top of a Lutyens basement, which even if you didn't come to Liverpool to see our School of Architecture or the Gibbard Cathedral, you should go down and look at the basement that Lutyens made. It's a wonderful piece of work. Okay, and finally, I learned recently from an old professor that it's very important in a lecture to say, and finally. He says it gives the audience hope. And finally, we won a competition in London, at the East End of London, on the site of the former Olympic Games, to make a culture centre that is a kind of civic investment, a civic kind of payback into the public realm of the grounds that were developed for the Olympic Games, but now become a public parkland. This East End of London, the Stratford, is the best connected piece of infrastructure in the city and is now one of the centres of densifying population in an already densely populated part of London. So you see a lot of tower buildings, a lot of them residential, but you see a kind of a convergence of infrastructure at this point in London, and the so-called East Bank, the culture centre, is a civic contribution to that densification. Within this complex, the local complex of East Bank, we, our firm, are making 3 buildings. We made the master plan together with Alison Morrison and Architecturia, but we emerge out of the business of making the master plan with 3 projects to do. A tall building, a residential building known as the Prow. The residential buildings pile up on one end of the site in order to free up the rest of the sliver of site for the public civic functions. At the right-hand side of your picture, you'll see the Sadler's Wells Dance Theatre, which is currently on site and will be a new dance venue in London for the established Sadler's Wells Company. And at the centre of the scheme I'm going to just talk about now, is a new building for the Victoria and Albert Museum. They're moving all of their collection to East London, and this will be a kind of display museum drawn on that collection. So what we're trying to make is a feeling of, it has to be a very light protected and, let's say, internalized experience in a designed, curated museum, but we're trying to find a way of relating the internal experience of the museum exhibits out to the wider world. This is the Olympic Stadium across the Queen Elizabeth Park, across the River Lee, and we're looking for ways of developing the depth of the building so that you can be within and without or in between. The stadium you see on the right-hand side, and you see the pile-up of buildings on our sliver site between the train tracks and the park. We're making, between us collectively, we're making housing, university buildings, buildings for the BBC Orchestra, buildings for the dance, and the museum for the V&A. So how to start when the museum is interested in what's within, but the museum needs an identity. So that very weekend, when we were considering this question, we went to see the only Vermeer painting that belongs in the National Gallery of Ireland. And it's a good thing to look at anyway, but Sheila was just saying to me, what about the sleeve? We hadn't really looked at the sleeve itself. And for some reason, she was wondering what kind of space is inside the sleeve of that garment. Now she argues to this day that she was talking about the other sleeve, but I misunderstood. This is the value of partnership, and I began to draw, for Sheila in a way, what I thought might be the space structure of the sleeve of the letter writer, and this was a series of drawings, not only thinking about that thought about the space around the body. And a few years ago in the book that Winke mentioned, I had written about this question of identity because I was listening to this text that Wim Wenders had recited in his film about Yohji Yamamoto, where Wenders talks about putting on the Yamamoto jacket and feeling reinforced in himself, by the jacket itself. And there's a beautiful scene in that film, if you haven't seen it, but there's a beautiful scene where Yamamoto is down on the floor with his scissors, kind of trimming away at bits of the fabric of the garment until he's happy with the hang. And it really reminded me of how we work in the studio between sketches and models, cutting and shaping and, so to speak, tailoring space. So this was the first, after the sleeve drawing that you saw, I was trying to put a bit more figure on it, and thinking about that Japanese concept of ma, the space between. And so we made some quick sketch studies of how you could clothe something at the same time as revealing it, because the V&A had to be entirely protected from light, but the exhibition viewer needs the relief of a glimpse out the window, same as the argument we had to make in the Glucksman Gallery that you've seen. So wonderfully, at exactly this moment, which was very helpful for the discussions with the directors of the museum, because they had put on the exhibition of Balenciaga's costumery, and Balenciaga's costumes, which are so powerful, seem familiar to me because in my boyhood I was an altar boy, so I know about priests' robes dropping from the shoulder, and then Nick Vasey, who's a London photographer, he photographs in X-ray, and the V&A asked him to photograph some of Balenciaga's costumery, his frocks. And what the photograph reveals, an X-ray, it reveals the structure that's necessary for that illusion of the drop, to survive. And so when we began to draw our drawings, we began to try to draw them like X-rays. So we were drawing the jacket and the frame. And it's interesting, when you come to the detailed development of work and you see the structural engineer's drawings or the mechanical engineer's drawings, like the bones of the body or the organs of the body. And they too have this, they do have this quality that you're seeing through like a doctor's X-ray. Forgive me, but in the last 2 years, we've only been to site once because of the COVID. And this is me and Sheila looking like proud parents in front of the monster, that's growing in the background. But it will find its skin, it will put its jacket on, and that will be its form. So I just wanted to explain to you how the museum is satisfied, because there's a hard core, there's flexible spaces, there's environmental control, but then how this value, all this conversation about dresses and jackets and the space in between has allowed us to develop the thickness of the crust so that the building has density and pockets of openness. It's entered from 2 levels, a podium level, which drives all the way back to the bridge that crosses to the park. On opposite side of the bridge is Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Centre. And so we're 8 meters up in the air. But then down at the ground, it opens to a new square that faces the river. So we have to have 2 points of entry. And then we have to develop this idea of the crust. And within the organism of the building, we force all the public circulation to develop itself inside in that crust. So you can move through the building in a wandering journey, but the wandering journey takes you from window to window, from landing to crossing, without having to enter the variously curated spaces at the 5 levels of the museum. So it's this feeling in this building, I think, is the feeling of security, stability within, which is what changing exhibition spaces need, for them to be flexible for change. They need to be rigidly defined, and then the variety of contact with the park, with the natural light, with the landscape outside, and with your fellow museum goers who are also, part of your experience. The reason we go to museums is to be with each other while we're in the museum. It's not only to be captivated by the object that we're looking at ourselves. It's a civic feeling of ownership, of shared ownership of what we see. And so we're trying to think about the movement spaces in the thickness of the walls and what they give back to the world outside and to the interior life of the person. So that's the X-ray section that you would have seen in the structure and the services. And then this is the cloak, the jacket that fits over that section. And one of the things that's been so interesting, a bit like having to learn about bricks to do the LSE, to learn about what bricks can be made to do. In this case, it was to learn about what we can do with concrete when it has to be applied, not poured. So this is all precast concrete. And I have to say that at the beginning of this, I had a fear that prefabrication could well be the enemy of craft, because we are entirely dedicated to the craft of construction. But what I found was when you go into these workshops where the prefabrication is being made, that the real craftsmen are now working undercover, not out on a windy site, but you find them there. And once their interest is awakened, it's possible to generate incredible levels of precision in the mix, in the surface, in the texture, and in the finesse of the form. So we're drawing lines all over this building to try to bring heaven down to earth, to bring the sky, to develop the proportion of the building so as that all lines hit the ground. We're trying to make those lines in shadows and light, that is to say that they are prominent as well as recessed in the concrete. And then it's big scale, so they're all 2 meter lifts, one stacked on top of another on another, and these go up fast on top of each other, but to the millimeter precision. Forgive me, this is like showing you the picture of the baby. I mean, this is where it is today. But it is putting it's pulling its jacket on from below, and it is being done with accuracy and with something like efficiency after all these delays. And I think that when it opens its doors, it will have this double feeling of feeling secure and resistant somehow, but also open and invitational, which is by way of saying, as an open invitation to David to come to London and walk through, say nothing, and see what he writes. Thank you. Of course.
Thank you for sharing your beautiful and magical work. Can we talk about the lyric theater for a moment? The wood panels, the paneling is extraordinary. What is it, and how does it affect the acoustics?
I come from, I was brought up on the Stony Road, if you know what I mean. This is a very cheap building at the Lyric, and we had a very good builder, and we had drawn this kind of basket work of timber to make the whole building is built and you come to a line, and there's very little money left because we spent a lot of it on the concrete, and the builder wasn't sure how they would do what we had drawn, and I said to him, now, this was a special builder. I mean, his daughter was studying architecture in the local school of architecture, and she had built a 1:50 model of the building on the site so all the builders could see. It wasn't an unusual situation. But I said to the builder, the real craftsmen on this site are the shuttering contractors who made the concrete. Why don't we ask them to, instead of throwing away their work, why don't we ask them now that they've finished, why don't we ask them to, if you like, shutter the interior of the theatre? Because we had no money left. So the builder bought all of the Iroko is poor man's teak. It's a hardwood, but bottom of the market, hardwood. But we bought all that he could buy, and then the shuttering contractors, with their laser setouts and everything, built that interior with millimeter tolerance. And also with the knowledge of how the wood would move. So the struggle then was between all the experts that are in theatre, because I've done clinical laboratories, so I know what's demanded by experts. But theatre, there's acoustic experts, there's lighting experts, there's actors, and because it's a producing house. So what the actor wants is a body in the audience, so they don't have, actors wouldn't like that, because that's a gap. They want you all together, wall to wall. And they also don't like their voices disappearing in the very gaps that the lighting technicians want in order to get direct lines of light down into the stage. And the acoustician doesn't want any gaps because they want sound to bounce. So what we did was it's actually like doing a building inside a building. We modeled it completely for acoustics, for light, and for actors to see. That's why I was using my ear, because it was the best model I could find of trying to develop a form inside that belongs only to the experience of hearing or seeing, but not to the visual experience of architecture seeing, but to the embodiment feeling. It was like another year inside the building making this auditorium. And it might look fancy to you, but it probably is fancy, but it works, and it also has figure, which people find themselves very attached to. So it's beautifully maintained, interestingly enough. I think if I'm thinking about construction, the thing I would say that I have learned is that the more difficult it is to do, the better chance you have of it being done well. Because if it's kind of simple and straightforward, but if it's a bit tricky, they say, I've got just the man, or somebody comes up who's up to the task and who does a better job. So my experience is that you might have seen what you might identify as a tendency towards complication, but in fact what that means is that it is better resolved than if it were simpler to do. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Any other questions? One more question.
Where is the timber for the Liverpool
Yeah.
School of Architecture coming from?
Yeah. As the project has come closer and closer to completion, the timber is changing from CLT to glulam to boards, back to glulam. We're living in an incredibly volatile market at this moment, when things that we thought were cheap and cheerful, like plywood, are now luxury commodities. So, best guess, I guess this will be a glulam structure. What I want is that it will be a truly structural structure, with no dressing up. So we've done a lot of structural modeling to prove that we can make these bow tie trusses, which come to a 0 point in the middle and cross over each other and open out to the light, to make them so unchallengeably, rigorously economic that they can only be built in timber. Because I think long term, it's a school of architecture, and students are expected to be able to look at the structure and expect it to make sense, So where it comes from depends on where it's available to come from. It has to come from a sustainable source. It has to be certified, but
Is it likely to be UK-based?
No, that's another pressure. But I mean, the bridge that you saw in Cork was the longest span available in a single beam. That's 27 meters if you're trying to buy laminated timber, and that had to come from Austria.
Yeah.
But you can also get it from Scandinavia, or
Right.
we can't have it. We can't get it in the UK.
Yeah.
You had this beautiful title on this lecture, Celebrating David. So I'm coming from landscape architecture, and we have a quite difficult relationship with architects sometimes. That's why we love David so much, because he has a sensitivity for light and dynamic and nature and topography. But in the work that you presented, and it's beautiful, you always were more in kind of small spaces, like really
Yeah.
twisted. So what's your relationship to the landscape?
To the landscape, yeah. I actually, I mean, for me, the relationship between a building and where it stands, and the perception of a building, how a building from the inside makes sense of its relationship to the exterior, and then how the approach to a building works on the exterior landscape, is almost, is as important as any aspect of the building's finish. I think the problem in architecture is if you reduce the expression of the building to a flat, taut skin, so everything inside is inside and everything outside is outside. If the building becomes a repellent piece, which I see so much of, I think that has the effect of separating our disciplines apart from each other, because the landscape is outside and the architecture has no outside inside. So I think if you open the doors, not just you're talking about opening the intellectual doors between the disciplines, but also if you open the breathing connection, then the landscape has a really important role to play. And one of the things that is very interesting here is the relationship between the landscape architect, LDA, who are doing the external landscape, and the ideas of the building and how they're participating in the ideas of the building. Yeah. I don't think there should be a war between your departments. Who's that in that medal? Who's that man in that shiny medal?
Several times in the talk, you mentioned freedom. Often with respect to interior space. But in answer to the last question, perhaps other comments, don't you have the impression of if there's a freedom, it's a constraint or interdependent freedom. Can you say a little bit more about this, the engagements that is seen, particularly in the faceting of the exteriors?
Yeah.
There seems to be a bounded character to the project. It's not elsewhere. It's in some ways only here.
Yeah.
And yet, so mine's a question about philosophy of freedom.
Yeah. That's yeah. No. And actually, it's considering, as I say, considering my background, which is restricted. I think it's a really interesting question, because maybe when the when the conditions are limiting, and when there are very few possibilities, then the possibilities you choose are more, those reaches you make for freedom are more significant because they're made from within the constraints of, it's a significant break if you break the restrictions that are fixed on you. Whereas if you were on, I don't know, I've never been on an open field out in the open with nothing around, you might have less to resist. And I have the feeling that unless you're up against it, you don't know how to measure the significance of the counter gestures that you're making. So, that Stravinsky says that the shackles that bind us set us free, when he's talking about the order of the inherited landscape of music. But the discipline itself I'm talking about here, and the discipline of architecture is certainly, a hard mistress. But in the situation of making a building, I think you can ask yourself back whether the gestures you're making have lasting impact if you can explain them somehow in relation to the conditions that produce them. So, I'm not going to be there in 200 years' time to tell people about jackets and Xrays, but I think that I think I do believe, I know I believe, that the thought is transferred to the artifact by the maker. I mean, architecture is to do with ideas, but the ideas are embodied in the reality of the structure, and they actually live in that structure. They're imparted, so to speak. And so if you want this feeling of freedom, which I think we all do, then it should feel like it's also releasing in a significant way, you know. The whole thing becomes exhilarated by being released, even though it only has certain ways to go. Does that help understand? But I might be just the man who's been jailed, being attached to his cell. I don't know.
I don't think so. It's a beautiful way of ending. Thank you so much.
Thank you.